Can you hear me now? Perfect. Okay, I'll start over. Good evening, everybody. My name is Julia Thomaso. I'm a research fellow at IRIS, and I'll be moderating today's conference on populism. So, as we've seen over the past decade, the word populism has moved into everyday's headlines, often as a shorthand from everything unsettling in our politics, from Donald Trump's victory in the US to the vote shares of far right parties in Europe. Yet the word populism conceals as much as it reveals. So, to help us untangle this topic and understand what populism is in the US today, as well as the differing interpretation in Europe, we're fortunate to be joined by someone who has spent years watching these current swirls on the other side of the ocean. Don Guttenplan, thank you for joining us here. So, you're the editor of The Nation, a magazine in the United States, and you published a book in 2018, The Next Republic: The Rise of a New Radical Majority. So it was about the election and the first year of the Trump presidency and the rise of populism of the left. So Don, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we'll come into my first question.
Okay, thank you. Bonjour. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. And I I hope it's okay that we speak in English because if I had to do this in French, I don't think I could manage. So I'm Don Guttenplan. I'm the editor of The Nation. I've been editor of The Nation since 2019, and I actually was working on this book in 2016. I'm just going to say a little bit, and then we'll get into it. But I want to talk a little bit about me and Donald Trump, and then how this book came to be. So, I'm a journalist by formation. I'm a historian. I have a degree, a doctorate in history from the University College London, but I've never practiced as a historian. Um, but I do tend to see things historically. Um, I've been a journalist for almost 50 years. And in 1982, I was unemployed, which happens a lot if you're a journalist in a big city. It probably happens more now. Anyway, we called it freelancing, but really it was unemployed. I was on the dole. Um, I was writing a profile of a real estate lawyer in New York and for money, because that's what you do. And he was the real estate lawyer for Donald Trump. But nobody, at that point, Donald Trump was not famous. But this lawyer was famous because if you wanted to build a building that was bigger than the law allowed, you went to this guy. His name was Sandy Lindenbaum, and he got you permission to do this. So I said, well, I gather that you get a lot of money per hour, Mr. Lindenbaum, and are you worth it? And he said, oh, yeah, any of my clients will tell you I'm totally worth it. And so I said, well, can I talk to any of them? And he said, sure, you can talk to Donald Trump. So he gave me Trump's phone number. I called him up. I said, I'm writing this profile of your lawyer. Can I come talk to you? He said, sure. I went up to see him in the Trump Tower. Everything was, gold plated or marble. Um, he bragged for about half an hour about how he was much smarter than everybody else, but he still needed a lawyer and that this lawyer was okay. Um, and then I went and wrote my profile. And then a few years later, I was working for the Village Voice in New York, and we were covering real estate. And so I would pay attention to his political forays in the city and his attempts to move the city government in one direction or another. And then the last time I actually spoke to him was in 1990 or 1991. He was having a feud with another billionaire, a man named Leonard Stern, who owned the Hartz Mountain pet food empire. And Stern was trying to improve his reputation by funding documentaries. And he was going to fund a documentary on Donald Trump. And Trump really didn't want this documentary to happen. So he decided that what he was going to do was he was going to inflict pain on Leonard Stern. Now, these are two billionaires. Stern was probably worth more money than Trump at that point because Trump had been mainly a casino owner and he was very unsuccessful at it and lost a lot of money. And although he never went bankrupt, his casino companies all went bankrupt. So what he did is he called the New York Post, a tabloid newspaper, and he said to them, the reason that Stern is backing this documentary is because his wife called me up for a date and I turned her down. And I don't know whether you are familiar with the mores of American journalism, but this was a scurrilous thing to say, but he said it on the record. So the New York Post printed a column, a gossip column, because he called the gossip columnist, that said that Trump says that Stern's wife asked him out on a date. And so then I did a story about this feud. And uh, it was the first time that it struck me that Trump will say anything. And also, I called him up to interview him on the phone after we'd spoken in person. Had some follow-up questions. And he kept on saying things that were really offensive, either about, I don't know, about people in New York or immigrants or something. He kept on saying things that were offensive and trying to get me to agree with him. And I didn't understand why he was doing this, but even though I try to be, accommodating when I'm interviewing somebody, these were things that I just couldn't agree with. So I just said, well, maybe you see it that way, Mr. Trump, obviously you see. I mean, I kept on not arguing with him, but not agreeing with him. And after about 10 minutes of the conversation, he said to me, by the way, Don, I'm taping this. I hope you don't mind. Um, so, then I realized his aim was to get me to say something embarrassing on tape, which he could use later against me. Um, but actually, in New York, it's legal for any one person, any one party in a conversation to tape it. And I was taping the conversation too. So I said to him, I said, that's fine, Mr. Trump. I've been taping you the whole time too. I hope you don't mind. And that was the last time I ever spoke to him. Although I did. So fast forward 2016, I was covering the presidential campaign for The Nation, where I was then editor at large, which just means I could move around a lot. Um, so I was moving around. First time I saw Trump was in September 2015 at the Republican Party summer meeting. They had the first candidates debate. And that was the debate where they asked them, if any of you will not promise to support the eventual nominee, raise your hand. There were 20 people on the stage and only Trump raised his hand. He was the only one who would not promise to support the others. And yet, as I wrote at the time, there was nobody on that stage who I thought could beat him, because he was the most effective communicator of anybody there. And he was willing to do or say anything to get attention. And he understood the attention economy in a much deeper way than anybody else on that stage. So I was writing these things, and my publisher called me in and said, are you interested in writing a book about this? And I said, well, I'm not really interested in writing a book about the election, because they come out after the election. Nobody really wants to relive a presidential election. But Trump is doing certain things, and then there are people on the left, because this was Bernie Sanders's first campaign, and I was mostly paying attention to Bernie Sanders. And I was very interested in the rise of this kind of potential majority left coalition in the US. So I said, well, I'll go to Trump rallies and I'll take notes, and I'll go to Sanders rallies and I'll take notes, and I'll talk to people and I'll travel around. I went to 12 states that year and filed 12 long pieces for The Nation. I said, but eventually I'm going to write a book about where I think the future in American politics might go. Not that it is going there, but it might go there. And that's what that book is. And he said to me, well, in October, he said, so are you finished the book yet? I said, I can't finish the book. I can't even start writing it. He said, why not? And I said, because I don't know whether Trump is the zig or the zag. In other words, is he the action or is he the reaction? And I wouldn't know that until after the election. So that's why the book came out when it came out. And I guess in 2020, I maybe convinced myself he was the zag, that it was a little blip of an episode in American politics that we had put behind us. But clearly we have not put it behind us. And so that brings us to where we are today.
Yeah, and you've touched on some of the key themes here. But so when you published, I guess my question is, when you published a book in 2018, it was at a moment where Donald Trump's first mandate was a shock to the American political system. But your book was both a warning about democratic erosion, but also a kind of a hopeful argument that a new progressive majority could emerge from the turbulence. So now in 25, now that Trump has returned to power for a second term, and the political landscape is like more polarized and even more fragile than before, looking back to 2018, and what you diagnosed, especially in 2018, what has changed most in American democracy today between Trump first and second mandate?
Sure. Okay. Well, first, I'm a reporter, not a prophet. So, uh, you know, you should remember that throughout the next few minutes. Um, I think what has changed the most, well, in 2018, when I was writing, I thought, well, there'll be another election in 2020, and maybe there will be a majority left coalition that will capture the Democratic nomination and offer people a genuine alternative. Um, of course, that didn't happen for lots of reasons, which we're not going to go into today. But um, Sanders ran in 2020, but the campaign got shut down by COVID, and people coalesced around Biden, and Sanders himself endorsed Biden. So, I think that was a lost opportunity.
Mhm.
But my book was basically an attempt to say, if you are a small d Democrat, which is I am, I'm a socialist and a populist and a small d Democrat. And what that means is I think that any alternative to majoritarian rule or majoritarian legitimacy is risky. But how do you put together a majority that can actually hold together and have a shared vision and govern? And that's what my book was an attempt to explore each element of that. So, African American rights, feminism, the ecology movement, labor movement, uh, the sort of left currents inside the Democratic Party. So there's a separate chapter essentially for each element of what I saw as a possible majority coalition, which didn't happen. That doesn't mean it'll never happen, but it didn't happen, and it hasn't come together yet. Um, on the other hand, Trump now is much more dangerous than the first time. I think part of what happened in 2016 through 2020 was Trump made a lot of noise. I don't actually think he expected to win. And I think he thought, well, if I lose the election, but I run for president, I get a lot of free publicity. It'll be great for my brand, great for my business. I'll make a fortune. I'll go back to private life even more famous. And, so for him, it was a win-win proposition, except that then he won and he had all these things that he said he was going to do, but many of them were very much a break with Republican policy. And he had, a team in government around him who were pretty traditional. So he wasn't able to do a lot of the things that he said he wanted to do. And the only thing he was really able to deliver on was tax cuts for the rich, which the traditional Republicans around him were very much in favor of, and appointing justices to the Supreme Court who would take away a woman's right to control her fertility. He did deliver on both of those promises. But he also said he was going to build a wall along the border with Mexico, and Mexico was going to pay for it. He said he was going to spark a renaissance in American manufacturing. He said, he was going to generate this incredible economy. It's true that he had COVID to cope with, but the economy was in ruins by the time he left office, which is one of the reasons that Biden won the election. So this time around, there's Project 2025, which brought together a bunch of people who were much more sympathetic to his vision of what a Republican government should be, which was essentially a right authoritarian vision in which the chief executive has immense power, and in which the sort of guardrails that normally restrain the executive are taken down. Um, so he's much more dangerous. The country is just as polarized. And in a way, the Democratic Party has the same problem it had in 2016 and 2020, which it has not. It has not followed the prescription in my book. I don't know why they didn't do it. So that they have not come together around a radical majoritarian program. Instead, they're still a corporate party who are easily discredited for being in hock to Wall Street. Um, and that makes it easy for Trump to pick off some of their voters.
And to slide to the topic of our conversation today, in your book, you vividly show how like American populism can take different forms. One is grounded in economic justice and democratic empowerment, and the other one is fueled more about cultural resentment and exclusion. How do you think Trump today, like, and his return to the White House, has shaped or intensified that divide?
Sure. Um, I want to answer your question, but I also want to argue with your premise.
Mm-hmm.
um, because I think it's true that populism is a revolt against elites. I think that is part of what it essentially is. But I would argue that the political revolt and the cultural revolt are in fact inseparable. That doesn't mean that they always, so there's a revolt against people who seem to dictate culturally and set the rules, or who are the people who, as it were, carry cultural authority. And there's a revolt against, an economic elite. Um, and we'll get to why I think Europeans misunderstand this later on. But I think it's important to say two things now before I answer your question. One is that they're connected. So, the Aaron Breitbart, who founded Breitbart News, he observed once that politics is downstream of culture. And what that means is that cultural change happens before political change. It also means that cultural change can cause political change. Political change doesn't tend to cause cultural change. Gay marriage is a great example. The culture was ready for gay marriage. Like, even when Obama ran for president and he was still against it, the culture had changed because gay people came out. They were visible and vocal. People who had previously been resistant to gay rights discovered that their nephew, their niece, their next door neighbor, their children, were gay, and they learned to live with that. So the culture changed long before the law changed, and long before the politics changed, and I think that's a deep insight. Um, but it's true that politics can bend, and populism can bend left or bend right. I think the other thing that's important to say, and I'm sorry it takes so long to answer this question, um, is that populism, we invented it in America. So, and it has a very specific historic meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that it always means the same thing everywhere, or that there aren't other forms of populism, or other countries that have populism. But populism in America was a specific response to the economic depression of the 1880s and 1990s, the Gilded Age, a time when, and this may sound familiar to some of you, when there were oligarchs who amassed vast fortunes, defied the law, thought they could rule, themselves without any restraint by government, resented paying taxes, were anti-immigrant, against, and they were basically trying to, as they say in, I suppose, the New Testament, grind the faces of the poor. So there was originally a rural revolt against this. There was a revolt by farmers who were being, their land was being foreclosed by banks. They were being thrown off their land. And there was a group called the Farmers Alliance. And this started in the South and in the Midwest. But there was also a group called the Colored Farmers Alliance, which is, say, African American farmers. These two groups came together in the first multiracial coalition in American politics. And they got together with something called the Knights of Labor. And in 1890, they founded the People's Party. They met in Ocala, Florida. And they came up with certain demands. One of their demands was rural free delivery. In other words, that you didn't have to pay extra to have the mail delivered if you lived in the country. This was a big deal. And the person who pushed it through Congress was a Georgia congressman called Tom Watson. In 1892, they met in Omaha, Nebraska. And this time, the farmers group was joined by two other groups. One was something called the Greenback Party, So they wanted to take America off the gold standard. They were essentially a pro-inflation party because they felt that credit was too tight, that farmers were having to pay too much for loans, but so were people who wanted to buy houses or, anybody who needed credit. They wanted to loosen credit by essentially printing more money, either just printing more money or using silver as well as gold, because the United States had massive silver reserves. And if silver was a medium of exchange, then that would essentially lower the value of money, which would make credit easier. So one group is the Farmers Alliance, one group is the Greenback Party, and the third group is the Knights of Labor, which was the sort of first labor union in the U.S. So this was a mostly urban-based, mostly Catholic group of skilled trades. So plumbers, builders, painters, carpenters, bricklayers, people like that, welders. And what did they want? What were their demands? Their demands were an 8-hour working day instead of a 10 or 12-hour working day. They wanted government assistance to farmers. They wanted pensions for soldiers who'd served in the Civil War. They wanted the secret ballot because until then, American elections were public. You had to hold up your hand for who you were voting for in public. So they wanted the secret ballot. They wanted to nationalize the railroads, the telegraph, and the telephone systems. They wanted postal savings banks, which I think you have in France, and they certainly have in many European countries. We still don't have them in the US. And they wanted a graduated income tax, and they wanted free coinage of silver. Okay, so a lot of their demands have come to pass. In fact, many of their demands were adopted by the Socialist Party in 1912 when they first formed in the US, and then they were slowly adopted by other parties. But this was a visionary program in 1892. And then in 1896, they ran again. And in 1896, Watson, the person who did the rural-free delivery, he was the vice presidential candidate for William Jennings Bryan, who was the nominee of both the Populist Party and the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party essentially was taken over by the Populists in 1896. And they were crushed in the election by the Republicans, William McKinley, who spent 5 times as much as they did. They were essentially bankrolled by railroad magnates. And that defeat so embittered Tom Watson that from presiding over this multiracial coalition, he decided that the only way that he was going to have a political future in Georgia, which is where he was from, was to campaign as a racist and as an anti-Catholic and as an anti-Semite. And so he became a really bitter racist. And because he was such a prominent figure in the populist movement, it essentially lent a taint to the populist movement that is still part of it. But I would say that it's also an example of what happens when a left populism is thwarted, which is sometimes people become embittered and they turn right. And, that I would say we saw a replay of that in 2016. Mm-hmm. You saw people, I can't say there are many people who I know who voted for Bernie Sanders and then voted for Donald Trump. I've personally never met one, but I've met a lot of people who voted for Bernie Sanders twice and then decided not to vote in 2024. And they just were so embittered by the way the Democratic Party kind of ran things that they just said, I've had enough. I'm not one of those people, by the way, but there are people like that.
I guess this brings me to a much like a scarier question, because today we see that across the political system and spectrum, we have less trust in our institutions. I would say the courts, the media, even elections sometimes, the government. So this trust has eroded dramatically in the U.S. recently, and we can see populist leaders have capitalized on this crisis of legitimacy. And they're often framing themselves as the true voice of the people against the corrupt elites. So beyond this, I think the deeper question is what happens when our faith in democratic institutions kind of collapses And in your view, can a progressive populism that you've been talking about rebuild faith in those in democratic systems?
Okay, well, this question I can just answer without a long
Okay.
historical detour. Um, I think what how shall I put it? Okay, institutions lose credibility because they deserve to lose credibility because they're not credible because they lie to us. You know, they lied to us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They lied to us about, you know, all sorts of policies. They lied to us about, you know, they lied to us about nuclear weapons. They lied to us about, you know, Ronald Reagan said that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. You know, politicians lie all the time and institutions lie. And, you know, as a journalist, I would say that if I have one article of faith as a journalist, it's that you can change things by telling people the truth. So if institutions want to recover trust, they need to start deserving it. They need to earn it. Um, I think it's not just populists who capitalize on that. I think it's anybody who capitalizes on it. But it is true, and you'll pardon me for a little crude Marxism here. It is true that in a Western capitalist society, the institutions are going to be controlled by the ruling class. So, to the extent that they are discredited, I would argue that's a good thing. They need to be reformed. They need to be renovated. In some cases, they need to be torn down. Um, and to answer the second half of your question, I think only a left populism can restore faith in institutions because only a political movement which has a credible claim to speak for and represent a majority of the populace has legitimacy. I mean, you know, we talked yesterday about these twin crises, a crisis of representation and a crisis of legitimacy. And that's something that's happening in my country. It's happening in your country. It's happening in other European countries. It's not happening in Russia because there's no pretense to representation or legitimacy. But in countries where they claim to represent the people, or the government claims to serve the people, you know, they have to authentically represent the people. I'll give you an example. You are probably, let's hope, too young to remember the beginning of the Iraq War. But I remember being on the streets in London with 1 million people saying, no, we don't want this war. And, you know, if you had taken a vote in any country in Europe, whether it was France or Germany or Britain or Spain, I remember having a T-shirt that had Bush, Blair, and Asnar on it. Those were the three villains of the Iraq War. Uh, the answer would have been no. There's no reason to go to war, and yet there we were going to war. So you know, how is that legitimate? If a president or a prime minister can just decide to invade another country because they don't like the leader or they don't like the system they have, that's not legitimate, and they don't represent us. So I think, you know, you need to have you know, what Trump says is, I alone can fix it. So that is not legitimacy. That is not representation. But what Kamala Harris said is, trust us and we'll fix it. That is not legitimacy and that is not representation either. You know, you need to have a political mechanism that allows for participation and representation, and then institutions can claim legitimacy. That's my view anyway.
I guess moving on the other side of the continent, in Europe, in your book, you say it a lot. We have the term populist is often thrown around kind of loosely, and it's mainly associated with extremism and authoritarianism, and it's almost automatically seen as negative. You've argued that this usage is mainly like misses critical dimension and distinction, especially between left wing and right wing populism. So, in your view, how has the European understanding of populism shaped or perhaps distorted the global conversation about what populism actually is?
Sure. Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So this is from Les Echos Français. Okay, this is somebody saying le populisme n'est pas un risque à prendre. So that's he says la France est gagnée par le populisme, du droite comme du gauche. Au miroir aux alouettes, tant les études rappellent qu'il mène à l'impasse économique. So that's Gilbert Sett, who was apparently a professor at the Neoma Business School. So, yes, of course, if you are somebody who is a professor of business, you are going to be anti-populist. Uh, then there's Bernard Cazeneuve, who says, Le populisme est un dégagisme qui finira par mourir de son propre poison. So, okay, he doesn't like populism either. Now, I'm not saying everybody has to like it. I mean, I like it, but that doesn't mean you have to like it. I would say you have to understand it. And those are comments that show they don't understand it. Populism is not the same thing as anything that we don't like. It's not the same thing as anything noisy or indecorous that we don't like. It's not the same thing even as right authoritarianism, although a lot of right authoritarianism is populist. Um, and it's also different from something else that you sometimes see in American discourse, which is popularism. So a bunch of writers associated with Vox. Do you know Vox, the website? It's a kind of a website that does a lot of explainers. And that Ezra Klein, who founded it, is now a columnist for the New York Times. He's very big on popularism. So what popularism says is if you have a policy that isn't popular with the people you are trying to get to vote for you, don't talk about it. So, and the big example of that in American discourse was abortion. In other words, more people in America are pro-abortion than anti-abortion, but the people who are anti-abortion are really anti-abortion. And so they're not going to vote for you if you spend a lot of time saying you're going to bring back the right to abortion. On the other hand, if you say, well, we're going to give you better health care or lower your taxes or make good schools for your kids, and you don't talk about abortion, maybe they'll vote for you. That's the theory. I think it's a stupid theory, but at least it's a coherent theory, but it's not populism. In other words, it has nothing about a culture of revolt against an elite. It has nothing about a deeper cultural understanding of why people feel disregarded or trapped. I mean, populism has nothing to say about why Hillary Clinton lost because she took a lot of popular positions. Populism, if you pay attention, will tell you that somebody who calls masses of working class people a basket of deplorables because she doesn't like the way they dress or talk is never going to win a majority of support. So I'd say, the problem with the European understanding of populism is that they see it as anything that is uh, gauche, but not a la gauche. Anything with bad manners on the right. And I just think that's a deeply flawed understanding that allows you, it's a kind of a shortcut from thinking, but a shortcut from thinking is not going to lead to deeper understanding.
But when we look at cases today, like in Turkey, for example, under President Erdogan, and we see how a leader uses political and like populist rhetoric and claiming, for example, to defend the real people against, again, the corrupt elites and like steadily eroding democratic norms by, for example, politicizing the judiciary, suppressing the independent media, and even deepening polarization in the country. And we can see similar patterns in Europe as well. For example, in Hungary under Orban. Do you think there are meaningful parallels or between the populist rhetoric and dynamics in the US today and the way leaders like
Yes,
Erdogan in Turkey use it?
I do
Yeah.
think there are meaningful parallels, and I'll tell you why, because there's a dimension that we kind of skate past.
Mhm.
And the dimension is the role of, I don't know, ethnicity, homogeneity in a modern nation state. In other words, if you are a nation state like the United States, or for that matter, Turkey, which is to say a multicultural society, um, that means that most people have to accept the idea that they live in a multicultural society. Now, of course, there will always be some people who won't accept that idea and who want their dominant cultural identity to be imposed universally. And I think that for right populists, that kind of, you can call it racism, you can call it ethno-nationalism. I think it's both. Certainly in the United States, it's both. Um, in some societies, it's not racism so easily, but it is ethno-nationalism. For example, in England, I think with Nigel Farage, there's a kind of, if you're not with us, you're not really British. If you're not with Erdogan, you're not really Turkish. And of course, Turkey is a multicultural society, just like the United States. So, you have, for example, Asians, Hispanics, Jews, blacks in the United States, you have Kurds, you have Christians, you have, you know, non-Sunni Muslims in Turkey. And so there's a way in which you can isolate these people and claim they are not the real people. And that is kind of the Tom Watson move. I mean, so it would be dishonest of me to say it's not part of the populist heritage.
Mhm.
It is part of the populist heritage. I suspect that that plays out differently in, I don't know, societies like Italy,
Mhm.
which are more homogeneous. France is also a multicultural society. So there's a way in which that kind of racist move is available here to a right-wing politician who's prepared to use it. But and I think that, I and I guess I want to say one other thing, which is, it may sound like I'm saying if I like it, it's populist, and if I don't like it, it's not. So I want to read you something in French and in English, which I think this shows an understanding of populism, which doesn't make me happy, but I think is true. So I'll start in French. Dans l'histoire récente des partis d'extrême droite en Europe, la plupart d'entre eux, comme le Front National, sont devenus populistes. Ils ont adjoint la dimension populiste au corpus des idées d'extrême droite, car après 1945, cette dernière a compris qu'il y avait un tabou sur la dimension antidémocratique liée à son idéologie durant l'entre-deux-guerres et conduisent au fascisme et au totalitarianism. So, there's a way in which, for far right parties, you can't be openly, or at least until recently in Germany, you couldn't be openly Nazi. Even in France,
Mhm.
you can't be openly anti Semitic. You can't be openly racist. So you can be populist. And it's a kind of a coded language on the right. And I think that's true. I think that is a level of analysis. So, in other words, those people are making populist moves, which I don't support. Um, but I think that is a correct understanding of populism. That on the far right in Europe, what populism has done is has given people a disguise to wear,
Mhm.
so that, as we say in Europe sometimes and in America sometimes, so you can't see their brown underwear. They still have the brown underwear, but they're wearing these clothes of populism on top of it. Um, so I think that's true. I think
Okay.
there is that connection.
I have one last question before we open the floor to the question for the audience. Um, in the end, your book is ultimately a hopeful one because it's arguing that change often comes from below, and it's driving by the people refusing to accept the status quo. So, given everything that's going on today and what's happened since you published the book, do you still believe in that we're moving towards a more progressive realignment? And does it give you hope today,
Ooh.
what we're living through right now?
I can't say I believe we're moving towards a more progressive realignment. I wish I could. I don't think the arc of history bends towards justice by itself. I think you have to bend it.
Mhm.
Um, but I think we can bend it. And, I'm doing my bit. I'm sure you're all doing your bits to bend it that way in the direction of justice. Um, I do think that there's a way in which Donald Trump's spell over the American public may wear thin. It seems to be beginning to wear a little thin, in terms of the economy. Now, I have to say that it somewhat disturbs me to see people on the left who would normally say, well, the stock market is not a measure of well-being, um, suddenly seizing on the fact that the stock market is going down to say, see, Donald Trump's a failure. Trump did say that he cares a lot about the stock market and he would cite it going up. So I understand wanting to use it against him, but I don't think that ultimately people are going to take to the streets because the stock market is going down. I think people may take to the streets because their neighbors are being deported, or because their mother's and father's Social Security isn't arriving, or because their pensions don't exist anymore, or because, you know, if they're military veterans and they're, have the right to have services, and the people who provide those services have all been fired. So I think there may be, the possibility of revolt, as the French history has taught us, is always there. And I'm hoping that we will seize that possibility. But I'm also hoping, and I'm serious about this, I'm hoping that if we do seize that possibility, we seize it in a genuinely democratic, majoritarian fashion. I'm not a Leninist. I don't believe that a vanguard can lead you to justice. Um, yes, I think I would say this is not a political judgment. It's just a personal confession. I'm a congenital optimist. So I don't think that the situation is hopeless, but it is very bad and very dangerous. And it doesn't help any of us to fool ourselves that it isn't as bad or as dangerous as it is, because I think it is. And I have to say, looking at you all, I feel like people my age should apologize for screwing it up so badly, because you're going to have to solve it. But, hopefully you will.
Thank you, Don.
Sure.
On that note, we can open the floor for questions. And I have a few online first, but we can, if there's question in the
Sure.
room.
But don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Would you stand up and
There's a mic coming up right here.
okay.
Yeah. You previously said that that political change often followed cultural change.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that in that case, the populist rise in America is mostly due to a reactionary movement of anti-elitism, and maybe even a reactionary movement against the LGBTQ community, or against sort of left social movement?
Do you mean the rise of right populism?
Yeah, the rise of right populism.
Yeah. Um, well, that's an interesting question. And I think a lot of people in America are debating that question. I wouldn't say I have a firm answer to it. I mean, there are people who say, well, would the Democratic Party do better if it wasn't so out front on gay rights? Or now I will tell you, and I'm sure you've seen this, there was a commercial that was everywhere in 2024 where there were Republican candidates. It was a nationally produced commercial. And it said, Kamala Harris, or maybe there was a Democratic candidate for senator, for Congress, is for they, them, whereas Donald Trump is for you. Meaning, the Democrats are pro-trans and the Republicans are anti-trans. So there was clearly an attempt to foment a backlash and profit from that backlash. Do I think that it actually made a difference to the election? No, I don't think it made a difference to the election. I think for people who are advocates of trans rights, it's the most salient issue. And I think for a few crazy fundamentalist Christians, it's the most salient issue. I think for most people, it's very far from the most salient issue. But I'll say something else, if I might, which is, I guess I think that our elite culture in the United States deserves a certain backlash. But I would say that that the other thing that I think operates is, if you are in a time where people feel disregarded and discarded and disdained, and where they feel like the establishment holds them in contempt. You can imagine, as we are here, there's a door on the left and a door on the right. And these are both potentially populist doors. But if the door on the left closes and you want to get out of this situation where you feel disregarded and disdained, and the only door open is the door on the right, some people will take the door on the right who might well have taken the door on the left if it had been open to them. So that's my answer.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Before you said the institutions are losing credibility because they deserve to lose credibility. And my question is, don't you think populism helps democracy to be alive by showing the bad side of the institutions and bringing back some reforms and debates?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I mean, even right populism, I would say, when its attacks contain truth, and this is a whole other, we could spend a whole other hour about how discourse has become debased. Facts are, more and more become matters of opinion. I mean, these are things that I find very difficult as a journalist. But I would say that yes, that if a right populist exposes hypocrisy, which they often do, that's a good thing for democracy. Hypocrisy should be exposed. Hypocrisy by those in power. Personal people, you and I in our own individual lives, we are allowed to be sinners. But if you are pretending to have the authority to set an example for other people and tell them what to do, and you're meanwhile taking bribes, or you're profiting from government action, or you're putting your relatives in positions of power, or you're doing whatever Sarkozy did, uh, you know, it's good that sees the light of day. Absolutely.
We have a question online here. Do you really think a leftist program can win in the US?
Do I think a leftist program can win the U.S.? Well, the best answer to that is we don't know, because it's never been tried. Um, the last leftist to be nominated by a major party in the United States was probably George McGovern, and that was 1972. Since then, we've had a series of centrists or corporate-friendly Democrats who have been nominated, and so you don't know. I mean, I would say that if you look at opinion polls and you ask people, do you think we should have a national health system? People say yes. If you ask people, do you think that rich people should pay more taxes, particularly people who earn more than $1 million a year, which is probably none of us in this room, people say yes. Now, maybe that's populist, that we want to, tax the millionaires to expand the commons for the rest of us. So, okay, it's populist. If you ask people, do you think that education past high school should be free? People will say yes. And yet no Democratic candidate has run even on those three things. You've had people who've run on restoring the right to abortion. You've had people who've run on, specific things, but those three very broad, very popular issues, no Democrat has ever run on those issues. So we don't know whether they would win. I like to think they would win, and the opinion polls suggest they are popular. So in a sense, and maybe this goes against what I said before, this is where populism and popularism overlap. But for some reason, could it be because the establishment controls the media and the parties? I don't know. But for some reason, these popular programs have never been tried by a major political party in the United States.
And there's another question online. To what extent can the rise of the ultra-Christian right in the United States be considered a form of populism that contributed to the election of Donald Trump? And is this relationship best understood as a cause or a manifestation?
Well, that's a great question. And to translate that into the language I was using earlier, is it a zig or a zag? Certainly the rise of Christian fundamentalism has happened in parallel with the rise of the Republican Party to a certain kind of electoral hegemony, even though ideologically the country, when you look at opinion polls, is always to the left of the Republican Party. And demographically, people, the kind of people who vote Republican reliably are becoming fewer and fewer. Fundamentalist Christians are becoming fewer and fewer, but they're very well organized and they're very noisy. And, they were very successful in stopping the Equal Rights Amendment from passing, which is when they really became a political machine. And then they became a kind of mail order machine for Ronald Reagan and his Republican successors. And Trump really courted them. And what Trump proved, which I think is a valuable lesson, if an expensive one, is that they don't give a damn about morality or Christianity or ethics. You know, they they would attack Democrats for being, willing to tolerate abortion. Trump has probably paid for abortions for some of his lovers, and he certainly, made no pretense at being a faithful husband or, a decent human being in that sense. And yet these fundamentalist Christians have embraced him because they're clearly interested in power. Now, is their embrace of him populism? Well, you could argue, I would say probably not, but you could argue that it is in one sense. You could argue that the cultural elite in America, of which, I'm the editor of The Nation, so if you have to hold up your hand, if you're a member of the cultural elite, I have to hold up my hand. We are mostly secular. And not only that, we are mostly militantly secular. And not only that, some of us, and here I exempt myself, have a lot of trouble concealing our contempt for people of faith, any faith, Muslim, religious, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist. Those are not fashionable views among the American elite. You are not supposed to really believe in anything. That's a little bit vulgar.
Mm-hmm.
So, people who are croyants, they probably do feel that they want to revolt, and their religious culture is in this sense, upstream of a political change. I mean, I guess I would argue that Democrats, if they want to be majoritarian, have to find a way to be more welcoming to people of faith. Than the only church that is welcome in the Democratic Party is the Black church. And that's a good thing because the Democratic Party would die without the Black church. But it's very interesting that that's the only exception.
Is there any other question in the room?
I do have a question. Thank you for your conference. My question is about US populism and its international reflections. Do you think nowadays the Trump US populism model has spread all over America, not just the United States, but the Americas? We have the example of Bukele, Sir Bukele in
Right.
El Salvador, but also of Milei in Argentina. We had Chavez in Venezuela, but nowadays Maduro. So could you give us kind of an analysis, please?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. And, if I were a history graduate student again, maybe I would write my thesis on this. Because on the one hand, I think, yes, US populism has had some influence in the Western Hemisphere. But it has also taken very different forms. So you could say that Milei is a populist. But in that sense, and this goes back to the historical argument I was making before, why did Milei come to power? He came to power because those in power were exposed as corrupt and discredited, and there was a vacuum. It's not that so partly it's that if the cultural elites destroy themselves, then there's a vacuum, and sometimes populism fills it. That, and I think that's what happened really in Argentina. In El Salvador, you had a society that was soaked in blood, where the right cultural elite were murderers, and the left were not murderers, but they were also not entirely able to deliver on their promises, and people became very impatient. So I think there's that. There's also, I don't want to be North American centrist here. There are indigenous, like Peronism in Argentina, is not populism, but it's not a million miles from populism. I would say, that there are many connections, and that's what I mean, that it would be fascinating to map those out, the connections between Peronism in Argentina in the 30s and 40s and 50s and populism in the US in the decades before that. Because I think there is a kind of fertilization of ideas. Mexico's another case where I would argue that the party now is a left populist party. I would argue that Claudia Sheinbaum is a left populist. In fact, I would argue that what's happened in Mexico in the last 8 years is an example of what can happen when you put together a durable majoritarian left populist coalition. But you have to remember that the party in power in Mexico before that was a right-wing party. But the party in power in Mexico for most of the 20th century was the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. In other words, the party of the institutionalized revolution. So that's kind of like the Socialist Party in France or in Italy. It's like they're squatting on the left, but they're not really a left party. They're not a populist party. They're an institutional party. They're not democratically accountable. So in that sense, what happened in Mexico is you had the kind of husk of a left party that was then pushed aside by a genuinely left populist party. I would love to see that happen in the United States.
And on that note, I think we're running out of time. So thank you very much, Don, for this insightful conversation.
Thank you so much, Julia.